The first thing the cameras saw was not the ribbon, or the smiling mayor, or the glass doors of the new Mercy Vale Community Center shining in the late morning sun. They saw an old man in a torn brown coat step past the flower stands, look down at the billionaire's polished black shoes, and spit on them. The sound was small. The silence after it was enormous. For one full second, nobody moved. The brass band near the sidewalk stopped halfway through a cheerful note. The mayor's smile stiffened. Reporters lowered their microphones. A woman holding a silver tray of donor pins covered her mouth. Julian Vale, the billionaire whose name was carved above the entrance in bronze letters, looked down at the wet mark sliding across the toe of his shoe. The old man did not run. He stood there with his shoulders bent, his gray beard uneven, his hands trembling from age or hunger or rage. His coat smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke. Around his neck hung a piece of blue string, and tied to that string was an old brass key, darkened by years of being touched. Security moved first. Two men in black suits rushed forward, one from each side, their hands already reaching for the old man's arms. A few guests shouted in disgust. Someone called him filthy. Someone else demanded that he be arrested. A young assistant whispered that the cameras were still live. Julian did not shout. He did not step back. That was part of what had made him famous. He had the trained calm of a man who knew that anger photographed badly. He looked at the old man and said one sentence, low enough that only the front row heard it. "Do you know what you just ruined?" The old man lifted his face. His eyes were pale and wet, but not confused. "Yes," he said. "A lie." Security grabbed him then. One guard twisted his arm behind his back. The old man winced, but still he stared at Julian's shoe, not at Julian's face. It was strange enough that one of the reporters noticed it. The old man was not looking at the billionaire like a beggar looked at a rich man. He was looking at those shoes as if they belonged to a dead person. Then, from the left side of the crowd, came a sound nobody expected, clapping. Not loud at first, just two thin hands striking together slowly. The sound came from an elderly woman in a blue church hat sitting in the second row. She was small, with a cane hooked over her wrist and tears on her cheeks. Her name was Mrs. Lila Boone, though almost nobody at the ceremony knew that. She clapped again. A man beside her, old and bent, stared at the homeless man for a moment, then stood with difficulty and joined her. Then another, then 5 more. Within seconds, a pocket of older people near the back of the reserved seating began clapping too. Not cheering, not smiling. Clapping with the grave, steady rhythm of people at a funeral who had decided the dead deserved one final honor. The applause spread just enough to frighten the donors. Julian's face changed. Not much, only around the eyes. He looked at the old woman in the blue hat, then at the old man being held by security, then at the shoe again. On the toe, beneath the spit, was a faint scratch across the leather. Julian had noticed it that morning, and nearly changed shoes because of it. But his assistant had said no one would see. The homeless man saw, the old woman saw, and now, somehow, half a dozen people who looked too poor to be on the guest list were clapping as if they had waited 22 years for that ugly little act. Julian's chief of staff, Marin Cole, hurried to his side. She had managed every detail of the opening, the donors, the press, the speech, the children's choir waiting inside the lobby, the plaque honoring Julian's late father, Conrad Vale, as a visionary of urban mercy. Marin leaned close and whispered that security should remove the man immediately. Julian did not answer. The old man twisted in the guard's hands and raised his voice, not to the cameras, but to the old people clapping. "Don't you clap for me," he said. "Clap for the street they buried." That was the line that made the ceremony impossible to save, because some of the old residents lowered their heads, and some kept clapping, and one of them whispered a street name that had not appeared on any city map in over 20 years. Briar Row. At that name, Julian Vale felt something cold move through him. He had heard it once before. Not from lawyers, not from city officials, not from his father's speeches. He had heard it from his mother, years ago, when she was sick and half asleep in the family house, clutching a shoebox under her blanket as if it held something alive. She had said, "Briar Row is not finished with us." At the time, Julian thought grief had made her strange. Now, an old homeless man stood in front of his charity center with a brass key around his neck. Spit on Julian's shoe. And a group of forgotten elders were applauding like witnesses. The cameras kept recording, and for the first time in his life, Julian Vale wondered if the building behind him had opened its doors on a grave. Before that morning, Samuel Pike had been known around the downtown blocks as the man who slept behind the old bus depot and fixed broken things nobody paid him to fix. He repaired a schoolboy's bicycle chain with wire from a discarded toaster. He mended a waitress's umbrella with a bent nail and a strip of duct tape. He once spent an entire afternoon fixing the loose wheel on a grocery cart for an old woman who collected cans, then refused the $1 she tried to give him. But he was not gentle in the way people liked homeless men to be gentle. He did not bless strangers for handing him coffee. He did not smile on command. He had a temper that came quick when someone called him lazy, and a silence that came quicker when someone asked where his family was. He kept his few belongings wrapped in oilcloth. He slept with his shoes tied together and looped around one wrist, as if even sleep could not be trusted. Every Thursday afternoon, rain or heat, Samuel walked 6 blocks to the construction fence around the Mercy Vale Community Center and stood across the street. At first, the workers ignored him. Later, they began calling him the watchman. He watched the steel beams go up. He watched the glass panels arrive. He watched landscaping crews plant young trees, where old porches had once sagged under flower pots and laundry lines. No one understood why he always stood at the same spot, across from the future main entrance, near a square of sidewalk where the concrete had a faint rust-colored stain that no pressure washer ever fully erased. He would stand there with one hand closed around the brass key at his neck. Then he would leave before dark, a month before the opening. A volunteer from one of the city's shelters had approached him. Her name was Clara Mays, a retired librarian with white hair, sensible shoes, and the stubborn kindness of someone who had seen too many people dismissed as lost causes. She brought him a paper cup of soup and asked if he planned to come inside once the center opened. There would be showers, job counseling, legal aid, and temporary beds. It was exactly the kind of place men like him were supposed to be grateful for. Samuel took the soup because hunger had made pride expensive. But he did not look at the building. That place was full before they built it, he said. Clara thought he meant the city had too many people in need. She agreed softly. Samuel shook his head. No, I mean full. Kitchens, radios, porch chairs, Sunday beans, babies crying, men arguing about baseball, women yelling across windows, a piano nobody tuned right. He stopped there, as if he had already said too much. Clara followed his gaze to the construction site. It was hard to imagine homes there now. The new center filled half the block, clean and bright, with a donor wall ready to list names in gold. What was here, she asked. Samuel's fingers tightened around the brass key. A street, he said, until they found a kinder word for stealing it. That was the first clue Clara kept. The second came 2 weeks later. She saw Samuel outside a church basement where donated coats were being sorted. A young volunteer had thrown out a pair of cracked black dress shoes, saying no one would wear them. Samuel pulled them from the trash with surprising care. He did not keep them for himself. They were too fine, too narrow, and too damaged at the sole. He wiped the dust from them with his sleeve. On the inside of one shoe, nearly worn away, was a gold-stamped initial, CV. Clara asked if they were worth something. Samuel said they had already cost too much. Then he wrapped them in newspaper and tucked them under his arm. The third clue came from the old key. Clara once asked whether it still opened anything. Samuel looked at her for such a long time that she regretted the question. It opens the place I keep going back to, he said. She thought he meant memory. She did not yet know he meant the last surviving door from Briar Row, stored in a church basement, because Samuel had carried it out himself before the demolition crews arrived. Briar Row had never been beautiful in the way donors liked to describe poor neighborhoods after they were gone. It had leaning porches, cracked steps, and gutters that overflowed every hard rain. Some windows were patched with cardboard in winter. Some families argued loud enough for the whole block to hear. There were unpaid bills, tired mothers, old men with too much pride, and boys who learned too early how to look tough. But there was life there. Samuel had owned Pike's Fix-It, a narrow repair shop between Mrs. Boone's beauty room and a corner grocery that sold peaches in paper bags. He fixed radios, lamps, fans, clocks, screen doors, and once, a wooden rocking horse that had belonged to 3 generations of the same family. His wife, Ruth, kept the books in pencil, because ink felt too permanent when money was uncertain. Ruth had a laugh that started quietly and then surprised people. She grew basil in coffee cans on the back windowsill. She called Samuel stubborn when he worked too late, and brave when he did not believe her. They had one daughter, Nora, who left for nursing school with 2 suitcases and a promise to come home every Sunday. For a while, she did. Then came the redevelopment men. They wore good coats. They brought drawings. They spoke of renewal, dignity, opportunity, and a partnership with the Vale Foundation. Briar Row, they said, would not be destroyed. It would be transformed. Every resident would receive temporary housing and the right to return once the new community homes were built. Small businesses would be compensated. Elderly tenants would be protected. A medical fund would be created for urgent cases. The promise sounded almost holy, and because many of the residents could not read contracts well, they asked Samuel to sit in on meetings. Samuel had finished high school. He could read forms. He could smell a trick in small print. He became reluctantly the man people brought papers to. At first, he believed the project might be good. That was the part he hated remembering. He believed just long enough to persuade others not to panic. He believed because Ruth wanted to believe. Her kidneys were failing, and the promised medical fund could help with treatments they were already skipping. He believed because Mrs. Boone's roof leaked and Mr. Alvarez had stairs too steep for his bad hip. He believed because hope sometimes arrives wearing the same shoes as danger. Then Samuel noticed the dates. The relocation payments were scheduled after property transfer, not before. The return rights depended on a second approval that was not guaranteed. The medical fund had no independent trustee. The small businesses were described as temporary informal economic activity, which meant they could be valued at almost nothing. Samuel refused to sign, not only for himself, for the block. He stood in a church basement meeting with 53 residents, sweating through a July evening, and told them they should wait. He said a promise not written clearly was a door with no hinges. That night, Conrad Vale himself came to Pike's Fix-It. Conrad was not the old portrait people later praised. He was younger then, broad-shouldered, persuasive, with silver beginning at his temples and the calm of a man used to being forgiven before he apologized. He wore black dress shoes so polished that Ruth joked afterward that Samuel could have shaved in them. Conrad told Samuel the foundation wanted cooperation, not conflict. He said delay would kill the project. He said powerful donors were impatient. He said good things required trust. Samuel asked for the return rights in writing. Conrad smiled and said, "Some men are so afraid of being cheated, they cheat their own people out of help." That sentence stayed in Samuel's body like a splinter. 3 weeks later, a document appeared with Samuel Pike's signature on it. It approved the transfer. It stated that Briar Row's residents had accepted the relocation terms. It listed Samuel as community liaison. It made him look like the man who had sold them out. By the time Samuel saw the paper, demolition notices had already been posted. He swore the signature was forged. Some believed him. Some did not. Fear broke the neighborhood into pieces. Families needed money. Elderly residents were told delays could make them ineligible. Small business owners were warned that legal challenges would consume what little compensation they might receive. Ruth collapsed 2 days after the medical fund was temporarily delayed. Samuel spent 3 nights sitting beside her hospital bed, wearing the same shirt, holding forms he did not understand and bills he could not pay. Nora came home and found her father in a hallway arguing with a billing clerk. His voice cracked from exhaustion. Ruth died before the first appeal hearing. After the funeral, Samuel went back to Briar Row and found his repair shop boarded. Someone had painted the word thief across the plywood. 2 weeks later, the building burned. The official report said faulty wiring in an abandoned shop. Samuel said the power had been cut. Nobody listened. The original ledgers, residents' copies, Ruth's treatment receipts and Samuel's notes were gone. The one person who might have helped, a young clerk from the relocation office named Daniel Price, vanished from the project and never returned his calls. By winter, Briar Row was fenced. By spring, it was rubble. By the next year, Samuel had no shop, no wife, no neighborhood, and almost no daughter. Nora could not forgive him for what she believed his stubbornness had cost Ruth. Samuel could not explain without sounding like a man reaching for excuses. Grief did the rest. The first Vale project stalled after public funding shifted. The promised housing never came. For years the land sat half-cleared, a scar in the city, until Julian Vale revived it under a new name. Mercy Vale Community Center, a place for the displaced, a place for men like Samuel. That was the cruelty nobody at the ribbon-cutting understood. Samuel had not come to spit on wealth. He had come to spit on the shine they had put over the wound. And when he saw Julian wearing Conrad Vale's old black shoes, the same shoes that had stood in his repair shop 22 years earlier, while a promise was softened into a threat, something in Samuel broke open. Not cleanly, not nobly, but completely. The city tried to turn the ugly moment into a security incident. By noon, edited clips were spreading online. The homeless man was shown lunging forward. Julian was shown standing calm. Security was shown restraining Samuel before anything worse happened. Commentators praised Julian's composure. Donors released statements about not allowing one disturbed individual to distract from an important mission. Maren Cole moved quickly. She had spent 18 months building the center's public image, and she knew reputational fires had to be smothered before they found oxygen. She told staff not to discuss Briar Row. She told volunteers that the old residents who clapped had been confused. She told reporters that Samuel Pike had a long history of unstable behavior and had refused numerous offers of assistance. None of that was entirely false. That made it more useful. Samuel had shouted at outreach workers. He had slept outside shelters. He had been cited for trespassing near the construction fence. He had once thrown a brick through the window of a vacant project office after finding old Briar Row floor plans in a dumpster. The brick had hurt no one, but the story had grown over time. Maren did not need to invent a villain. She only needed to crop the man until nothing remained but his worst day. That afternoon, Samuel sat in a holding room beneath the center before police transport arrived. Julian had not pressed charges yet, partly because cameras made mercy profitable, and partly because the applause still troubled him. Samuel's wrists were not cuffed, but a guard stood near the door. Julian entered with Maren behind him. Up close, Samuel looked smaller. His beard was yellowed in places. His hands were cracked. There was a dark bruise forming where security had grabbed his arm. Yet his eyes remained fixed on Julian's shoes. Julian had changed them. The old black pair was gone. He now wore brown leather shoes from the emergency wardrobe his staff kept upstairs. Samuel noticed. A bitter smile moved across his face. "Couldn't stand wearing your inheritance?" he said. Maren advised Julian not to engage, but Julian did. He told Samuel that whatever grievance he had, humiliating a public charity ceremony would not bring anyone justice. He said the center would feed people, house people, and help people rebuild. He said the old man had attacked the very thing his own life proved the city needed. Samuel listened with his head tilted slightly, as if hearing a sermon from a thief. Then he said, "Your father promised homes. You built showers." The line struck harder than Julian expected. Maren immediately stepped in. She said Briar Row had been reviewed by lawyers years ago. She said every resident had received lawful relocation offers. She said Samuel had signed as community liaison. At that, Samuel's face changed, not with surprise, with disgust. He reached into his coat slowly. The guard moved, but Samuel pulled out only a folded stack of papers held together by a rubber band so old it had cracked white. He dropped them on the table. Eviction notices, copies of copies, edges soft from being unfolded too many times. On the top page, beneath legal language and stamped dates, was Samuel Pike's printed name. Community Liaison. Julian looked at it. Maren did not. That was the first contradiction Julian noticed. Maren was too quick not to look. Samuel saw it too. "She knows where the bodies are buried," he said. Marin's expression remained controlled, but color rose at her neck. She said the meeting was over. Before leaving, Julian asked Samuel why the old residents had clapped. Samuel leaned back. For the first time, his anger seemed tired, because they remember who signed and who didn't. That should have been impossible. The city file contained Samuel's signature. The project history contained Samuel's cooperation. The public narrative contained Samuel's betrayal. But the people who had lost the most believed something else. Julian returned upstairs unsettled. Inside the lobby, the opening continued in a wounded form. The ribbon had finally been cut. Guests toured counseling rooms and the free clinic wing. Children sang under a banner about compassion. On the donor wall, Conrad Vale's name stood at the top. Julian stopped before the bronze plaque bearing his father's portrait. Conrad Vale was described as a man who turned forgotten blocks into places of hope. Julian had spent his adulthood protecting that sentence. His father had been demanding, charming, and impossible to please. Conrad taught Julian that reputation was not vanity, it was architecture. Once built, it could shelter generations. Once cracked, everyone inside got wet. Julian was 19 when the Briar Row deal happened. He remembered little. He had been away at college, embarrassed by his father's insistence that he attend foundation dinners. He remembered his mother arguing behind closed doors. He remembered Conrad returning home late one night with soot on his cuffs. He remembered years later his mother's shoebox under the blanket. But memory was not evidence. And Julian had built too much on the belief that his father's harshness always served a greater good. That evening, Julian visited his mother's old sitting room in the Vale house. The room had been kept almost unchanged since her death. Pale curtains, a writing desk, a blue glass lamp. He had avoided it for years because grief made ordinary objects accusatory. The shoebox was still in the bottom drawer. He had forgotten that, or told himself he had. Inside were old photographs, a church program, a ribbon from some charity dinner, and one small envelope labeled in his mother's handwriting. Briar Row. Julian opened it. There was no confession, no dramatic proof, only a newspaper clipping about a neighborhood meeting. A photograph of Samuel standing beside Ruth in front of Pike's Fix-It, and a torn corner of a document with 3 handwritten words in the margin, not his signature. Julian sat very still. His mother had written those words. Beneath them was a date, the same date as the transfer approval. Julian did not sleep much that night. The next morning, Marin arrived before 7 with a crisis plan. She wanted Julian to announce a restorative outreach initiative for former Briar Row residents. A listening session, private stipends, maybe a memorial garden. Enough acknowledgement to look compassionate, not enough to imply wrongdoing. Julian asked how she knew which residents were former Briar Row residents. Marin paused. Only slightly. She said the foundation maintained historical outreach lists. Julian asked why those lists had not been used to invite them formally. Marin replied that many addresses were outdated. Julian asked why several had appeared at the opening anyway, seated together, without badges. This time Marin did not have a ready answer. The truth was that Clara Mays had brought them. After the incident with the black shoes, Clara had started asking questions. Librarians know how to follow paper trails because paper, unlike people, is bad at lying gracefully. She found old city directories, church bulletins, property notices, a reunion announcement for former Briar Row residents printed years ago in a neighborhood newsletter. She found Mrs. Lila Boone in a senior apartment building above a pharmacy. Mrs. Boone had not wanted to talk at first, but when Clara mentioned Samuel Pike, the old woman turned toward the window and said, "That man carried my door." Clara thought she misheard. Mrs. Boone explained that when demolition began, she had begged workers to let her remove the door from her old beauty room because her late husband had painted it blue. They laughed. Samuel came that night with tools, took it off its hinges, and carried it 6 blocks to the church basement. He did the same for others: a mailbox, a porch rail, a kitchen shelf. Little pieces of homes the project had declared worthless. That was why some of them came to the opening, not to celebrate, to see whether any part of the promise had survived. When Samuel spat on the shoe, Mrs. Boone recognized the man who had been blamed for abandoning them. And she recognized the shoe. Conrad Vale had stepped on her fallen appointment book outside Pike's Fix-It, the night he came to pressure Samuel. The scratch on the toe had come from the little metal clasp. She remembered because Conrad had looked down, annoyed, and said the phrase none of them forgot. Poor things always leave marks. At the opening, when she saw the same scratch on Julian's inherited shoe, she knew exactly why Samuel had broken. Clara brought that story to Julian 3 days later, not to the press, to Julian. She found him outside the center after a donor meeting, standing where Samuel used to stand across the street. She handed him a folder and told him she was too old to enjoy watching powerful men pretend surprise in public. Julian almost dismissed her. Then she told him about the door, about the blue paint, about Mrs. Boone, about the phrase, "Poor things always leave marks." Julian had heard that phrase before, too. His father used it when wine stained a tablecloth, when tenants complained, when journalists asked inconvenient questions, when Julian as a boy came inside with muddy shoes. Poor things always leave marks. A man could inherit more than money. He could inherit a way of looking at the world and mistake it for wisdom. Julian opened Clara's folder. Inside was a photograph of the old Briar Row church basement. Against one wall stood doors, shelves, signs, railings, and boxes labeled by family name. On the far left was a blue door with a brass lock. The keyhole was visible. Julian knew, before Clara said it, what key would fit. The one around Samuel's neck. That night, the foundation board called an emergency meeting. Maren presented Samuel as a threat. She said activists were exploiting a sick man. She said reopening Briar Row would endanger the center, the foundation, and every person who depended on its services. She did not deny that the old project had been imperfect. She called it historically complicated. Then she placed a document in front of Julian, a settlement affidavit from 22 years ago. It claimed that Samuel Pike had accepted money, signed community approval, and later harassed project staff after misusing funds meant for his wife's care. Julian read the page twice. There it was again, Samuel's signature. But now that he was looking for wrongness, he saw it. The S was too smooth. The Pike was too narrow. Julian had seen Samuel's real handwriting on the folded eviction notices. Harsh, blocky letters. A carpenter's grip. A man who pressed hard enough to scar the page underneath. This signature floated. Maren said the file was conclusive. Julian looked at her and asked where the original was. She said originals from that period were destroyed in the Briar Row fire. The room went quiet, because she had answered too fast again, and because Julian had not mentioned a fire. The first crack in the truth did not come from a courtroom or a confession. It came from a basement that smelled of dust, hymnals, and old varnish. Clara took Julian there on a gray Saturday morning. The church had changed names twice since Briar Row fell, but the basement remained. Its walls were cinder block. Its ceiling pipes clicked when heat moved through them. Folding chairs were stacked near a pantry. Along the back wall stood the saved pieces of a neighborhood, a blue door, a cracked grocery sign, a narrow shelf with faded spice labels still stuck beneath it, a mailbox dented on one side, a wooden salon chair from Mrs. Boone's beauty room. Julian walked through the objects like a man, moving through evidence after years of calling it clutter. Samuel was already there. Clara had brought him earlier, though he had not wanted to come. He stood beside the blue door with one hand on the brass key. His coat looked even more ragged indoors. His anger, without the crowd around it, seemed less like fire and more like something burned down long ago. Julian did not apologize. Not yet. Some apologies are only another kind of theft when they arrive before truth. Instead, he asked Samuel to open the door. Samuel stared at him. Then he took the key from around his neck. His hand shook so badly that Clara almost stepped forward, but Samuel steadied himself. He slid the key into the lock. It turned. The sound was small, but everyone in the basement heard it. Behind the door was nothing, of course, just cinder block and shadow. But for Samuel, it had once opened into Mrs. Boone's beauty room, where women sat under dryers, where Ruth sometimes came to laugh, where a neighborhood learned news before newspapers did. Samuel removed the key and said, "They said none of this mattered because none of it was worth enough." Julian looked at the saved objects. For the first time, He understood that compensation had been the wrong language. Some thefts were not measured by market value. A porch rail could be worthless to a city and priceless to the hands that held it every morning. The second proof came from the church ledger. Clara had found it in a storage cabinet behind boxes of Christmas candles. The ledger recorded donations and emergency payments made through the church during the relocation months. It listed families who received bus fare, meals, temporary motel help, and medical collections. On the line for Ruth Pike, there were 3 entries. Community Kidney Fund promised. Payment delayed. Private collection delivered by DPDP Daniel Price. The missing clerk. Julian hired a private investigator, quietly at first. Marin warned him that digging would create legal exposure. Julian asked whether truth was now a liability category. Marin said nothing. Daniel Price was found in a lakeside town 2 counties away, running a small print shop under his middle name. He was 61, diabetic, and frightened before Julian even introduced himself. He refused to speak on record. Then Julian showed him the photograph of Samuel and Ruth outside Pike's Fix-It. Daniel sat down. Some guilt waits for permission to collapse. He admitted he had been a junior relocation clerk on the Briar Row project. He said Samuel had refused to sign the approval without written guarantees. He said Conrad Vale was furious because donors were threatening to withdraw. He said Marin, who was then a young legal assistant, helped prepare corrected community documents using signature samples from attendance sheets. Daniel did not know who physically forged the signature, but he knew it was forged. He also knew about the medical fund. Money had been pledged, photographed, and announced. It was then redirected into administrative transition costs after Ruth Pike's emergency application became inconvenient. Daniel had collected cash from church members and delivered it to Ruth anonymously because he was ashamed. He had kept one thing, a cassette tape. The relocation office recorded community meetings for minutes. Most tapes were destroyed. Daniel had taken one home by accident, then kept it when the fire erased the files. On it, Samuel could be heard refusing to sign, not angrily, clearly. He said he would not approve any transfer until return rights, medical funds, and elderly protections were written plainly. Then Conrad Vale's voice came through, smooth and cold. If Pike will not sign for them, then Pike will be remembered as the man who cost them everything. Daniel had lived with that sentence for 22 years. When Julian listened to the tape, he had to stop halfway through. Not because the evidence was unclear, because his father's voice was. Every tone was familiar. The patience, the contempt underneath the patience. The way Conrad made a threat sound like advice. Julian finally understood that his childhood had not been separate from Briar Row. It had been training. Marin denied everything. She called Daniel unreliable. She said the tape could be incomplete. She said Conrad Vale had been a difficult man, but not a criminal one. She said the foundation would be destroyed if Julian indulged old grievances without context. Then Julian showed her the torn document from his mother's shoebox, not his signature. Marin's composure cracked, only for a second, but long enough. Julian asked why his mother had kept it. Marin looked toward the window. For the first time, she seemed older than her carefully cut hair and tailored suit. She had protected the Vale Foundation for nearly her entire adult life. She had begun as a legal assistant desperate to escape her own poor background. Conrad had rewarded loyalty. He had taught her that institutions survived by absorbing damage quietly. She told Julian that his mother found out too late. She wanted Conrad to repair the damage after Ruth Pike died. Conrad refused. There had been arguments. There had been threats of divorce. Then Julian's mother became ill, and the matter was buried under private grief. Marin said she had been young. She said she had not understood. Samuel, who had been brought in only after Marin agreed to speak before the board, listened from the end of the conference table. His hands were folded around the brass key. When Marin said she had not understood, Samuel looked up. "No," he said. "You understood who would pay." No one spoke. That line did what files could not do. It moved guilt out of paper and back into the room. But the final irreversible truth came from Nora. Samuel's daughter had not seen her father in 7 years. Clara found her through an old nursing license record. Nora Pike was now Nora Ellis, a hospice nurse in another city, with silver in her hair and the tired grace of someone who had spent years helping other people say goodbye while never finishing her own. She refused Julian's first call. She refused Clara's second. Then Clara mailed her a copy of the church ledger and a photograph of Ruth's name. Nora came to the center on a rainy afternoon when the donor banners had already been taken down. Samuel did not know she was coming. He was in the half-open lobby, sitting on a bench near the free clinic wing, because Julian had asked him to review the Briar Row materials before a public statement. Samuel hated being inside the building. He said the air was too clean. But he came because the truth, once moving, needed witnesses. Nora stopped 10 feet from him. For a moment, she was 22 again, standing in a hospital hallway, believing her father's stubborn pride had cost her mother treatment. Samuel saw her and stood too quickly. One hand went to the bench for balance. He did not say her name at first. Maybe he was afraid it would break. Nora held a folded paper. The church ledger copy. Her mother's line. Payment delayed. Private collection delivered by DP. Then she took from her purse a small envelope Samuel recognized. Ruth's handwriting. Nora had kept it all these years, unopened until that morning, because grief can make even paper dangerous. Inside was a note Ruth had written during her last hospital stay. It did not clear every legal detail. It did not name every villain. It did something more painful. It proved Ruth had known Samuel was fighting for the neighborhood, not betraying it. Ruth had written that Samuel blamed himself too much, that the people pressuring him were counting on his shame, and that Nora should not let anger make an orphan of her while her father was still alive. Nora read the note in silence, and by the time she finished, her face had changed. Samuel stood before his daughter like a man waiting for a sentence. Nora crossed the lobby slowly. She did not embrace him at first. She touched the brass key at his neck. Then she said, "You kept the door." Samuel's eyes closed. All the public proofs, all the legal admissions, all the recorded evidence had not undone him. That sentence did, because Nora understood. He had kept the door when he could not keep the house. He had kept the key when he could not keep the family. He had kept the truth badly, angrily, imperfectly, but he had kept it. Julian watched from across the lobby and felt the final defense inside him fail. This was no longer about saving the center. It was about deciding whether a building made for mercy could survive honesty. The second public gathering at Mercy Vale Community Center was smaller than the first, but nobody mistook it for less important. There was no brass band, no ribbon, no donor pins on silver trays. The flower stands were gone. The mayor did not attend. Several board members resigned that morning. Reporters came anyway, because the city had learned that something larger than a vandalism incident was unfolding. This time, the front row was reserved for former Briar Row residents. Mrs. Boone wore the same blue church hat. Mr. Alvarez sat beside her with both hands on his cane. Clara Mays stood near the aisle, with a folder pressed to her chest. Nora sat beside Samuel. Samuel had been offered clean clothes. He accepted a washed shirt and a repaired coat lining, but refused a new coat. He said some things should not be polished before they were heard. Julian stood at the podium. Behind him, the bronze plaque of Conrad Vale had been covered with a plain white cloth. That image alone did more than any opening speech could have done. Julian did not begin by praising the center. He did not describe his family's generosity. He did not call the matter complicated. He said Briar Row. The name moved through the crowd like a door opening. He explained that the official history of the project had been false. He said Samuel Pike had not signed the community approval. He said return rights had been promised and withheld. He said medical funds announced in public had failed the woman whose need helped sell the promise. He said records had been altered, residents had been pressured, and reputations had been damaged to protect powerful men. He named his father, he named the foundation, he named himself too, not as a child responsible for the original act, but as the man who had benefited from silence and nearly continued it because silence was easier than shame. Maren Cole had resigned the night before. She was not publicly humiliated on stage. Julian refused to turn the reckoning into theater, but her written statement was entered into the record, along with Daniel Price's sworn testimony. the cassette recording, the ledger, the forged signature analysis, and Ruth Pike's note, shared only with Nora's permission. The foundation would create a restitution trust controlled by an independent board, with former Briar Row residents and descendants included. The center would remain open, but its name would change. The donor wall would be removed. A legal clinic inside the building would serve displaced tenants free of charge. The first permanent exhibit in the lobby would not honor Conrad Vale. It would preserve Briar Row, not as poverty decoration, as a neighborhood. Photographs, names, doors, signs, stories. The blue door would stand inside the entrance, not as a symbol of charity, but as a witness. Then Julian stepped away from the podium. He walked to Samuel. The room tightened. Everyone expected an apology, a handshake, a dramatic embrace, something cameras could package cleanly. Samuel did not make it easy. He looked at Julian's shoes. This time, Julian wore the damaged black pair, Conrad's shoes. The scratch was visible across the toe. Julian had not cleaned away the mark from the opening. He had let the leather stain. He said later he wanted to remember that some marks deserve to remain. Standing in front of Samuel, Julian removed the shoes. The gesture shocked the room more deeply than words would have. He placed them on the floor between them. Then he said, "These do not belong at the front of anything anymore." Samuel stared down at them. For a moment, his face carried the old rage. The crowd seemed afraid he might kick them aside. Instead, he bent slowly, with Nora helping him, and picked up one shoe. He turned it in his hands. He looked at the scratch made by Mrs. Boone's appointment book 22 years earlier. He looked at the polished leather his spit had marked. He looked at the object that had carried one man's contempt into another man's inheritance. Then Samuel handed the shoe back. "No," he said, "put them in the case. Let people see what walked over us." That became the heart of the exhibit. Not because shoes were proof by themselves, because they showed how ordinary cruelty can travel, on polished leather, in careful language, through legal documents, across generations, into buildings with beautiful names. Samuel did not become rich overnight. That would have been too simple, and life had already taken too much to be repaired with one check. The restitution trust provided housing, medical debt relief, and compensation for surviving residents and families. Nora helped Samuel move into a small apartment 2 blocks from the center. He chose it because the morning light came through the kitchen window in a way Ruth would have liked. He still walked to the center every Thursday, but now he went inside, not for charity, for the Briar Row room. Sometimes he sat near the blue door and watched visitors read the names. Sometimes he corrected details when young volunteers got the story too neat. He told them Briar Row had not been perfect. He told them not to turn poor people into saints, just to prove they were robbed. People should not have to be perfect to deserve justice. Mrs. Boone came on Sundays after church. She brought old appointment cards from her beauty room. Mr. Alvarez brought a porch nail wrapped in cloth. Others brought photographs, rent receipts, recipes, and one cracked radio Samuel had fixed twice before the demolition. Clara organized the archive with librarian precision and a tenderness she pretended was professionalism. Julian stepped down from daily control of the foundation for a year while investigations and reforms continued. Some called it weakness, others called it strategy. Julian did not answer either group. For the first time, he seemed less interested in what a thing was called than what it cost. He visited Samuel once in the apartment. It was awkward. No music swelled. No easy forgiveness arrived. Samuel made coffee too strong and served it in mismatched mugs. Nora stayed for the first 10 minutes, then left them alone because some conversations require witnesses and some require air. Julian told Samuel that he did not know how to carry a name that had hurt so many people. Samuel looked toward the window. "You don't carry a name by polishing it," he said. "You carry it by telling where it has been." That was as close to forgiveness as Samuel could give then, and maybe it was more useful than forgiveness. Months later, when the center reopened under its new name, the first thing visitors saw was not a billionaire's portrait. It was the blue door. The brass key hung beside it in a small glass case donated by Samuel only after Nora promised he could borrow it whenever he wanted. Below the key was a line from Ruth's note, chosen by Nora. Do not let anger make an orphan of you while love is still alive. Samuels stood near the back during the reopening, uncomfortable with applause now that it was meant for him. His coat was the same brown one, repaired at the elbows. His beard was trimmed but still uneven. Nora held his arm. Mrs. Boone sat in front wearing her blue hat. Julian spoke briefly. Then he stepped aside and let the former residents open the door. Of course, the door opened onto the same lobby as before. Glass, sunlight, polished floor, quiet people waiting. But when Samuel turned the key and Mrs. Boone pushed the blue door inward, many in the room saw something else. A beauty room, a repair shop, a grocery with peaches in paper bags, a street that had been called worthless by men who could not price what mattered. Samuel did not cry loudly. He only placed one hand on the doorframe and bowed his head. The cameras captured that too. But this time, they did not capture a spectacle. They captured a man standing at the entrance of a place that had once erased him, holding the door open for everyone who had been told they left no mark. Some wounds are not hidden because nobody remembers them. They are hidden because remembering them would cost too much. This story leaves us with a hard question. When a powerful person gives generously with one hand, do we ever ask what the other hand took before the giving began? A meal, a shelter bed, a new building, a public apology. These things can matter, but they cannot replace the truth. Samuel Pike was not perfect. His anger wounded people. His public act was ugly. But underneath that ugliness was a man who had carried a key for 22 years. Because no one else wanted to admit there had once been a door. Maybe that is why the old residents clapped. Not for disrespect, not for revenge. They clapped because for one brief moment, the polished story cracked and the buried street breathed again. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Julian did enough to make things right? Or can some losses never truly be repaid? And if you enjoy emotional stories about hidden truth, dignity, justice, and the cost of silence, please subscribe and stay with us for the next story.